Hi guys, and welcome back. In this video, we're going to spin up an instance of the Neo4j graph database engine on your local development workstation. Now, there's a lot of different ways to deploy Neo4j. In fact, the easiest way to get started with Neo4j is actually to spin up a sandbox account on their website, neo4j.com/sandbox or sandbox.neo4j.com. However, I personally prefer the independence of being able to download a container image to my development workstation and to spin up as many different containers from that container image as I need to. That helps prevent me from, dealing with internet outages where I can't access managed services online, since I have the availability to just spin up containers locally. So let's switch over to our desktop here. And as you can see, I've got the Neo4j documentation here up in front of me. And under the Neo4j administration section of the documentation, there's actually a Neo4j in Docker document here that describes basically how to spin it up. Now, Neo4j is an open source database platform that is licensed under the GPL, I believe. And what that means is that you can actually see a lot of the source code for the Neo4j database engine out on GitHub. So if you head over to the Docker and Neo4j documentation here, there's actually a link over to the GitHub repository that contains the Docker files and all of the supporting files to actually build the container image that we're simply going to be downloading and using. So just be aware that it is an open source project and that all this stuff can be viewed and contributed to and audited by people like you. So what we're going to be doing is actually just using the pre-built container image instead of actually having to go through the process of building it ourselves. So what we can do is head over to how to run Neo4j in Docker, and then there is a link here to the Neo4j image on Docker Hub. And so this is the repository page that basically just gives you kind of the documentation, all of the different supported versions or the tags for the container image that are supported by the Neo4j platform. Now, the commands to actually spin up Neo4j, I would ignore the one that you find on the Docker Hub products page here, or image page rather, because that one isn't up to date. It doesn't have all of the different supported parameters, but rather I would recommend using the one directly here in the documentation, which is pre-built for you. So this container image command basically is going to spin up a new container using the latest version of the Neo4j database engine as indicated by this tag right here. Now there's a bunch of other parameters that are being utilized here. For example, we are exporting port 7474, which is where the web interface for Neo4j is available. So Neo4j does have a desktop version that you can install if you'd prefer that. I personally prefer the isolation of Docker containers because then I don't have to install anything on my development system. It just helps keep things a little bit cleaner on your dev system. So that's why I prefer using the container image instead of the Neo4j desktop version that includes a GUI application that allows you to connect to the database engine. So the nice thing is that we don't have to install that client application. We can actually just access the web interface using port 7474. Now, if you want to connect to the Neo4j database engine using the Bolt driver, so if you're planning to write some code on your development system and connect into that Docker container, then you'll also want to export port 7687 as well. So that'll allow you to access the Bolt protocol as indicated here in the documentation. Now, by default, the Neo4j engine does not have a certificate, so you can't use port 7473 by default. However, you can customize the container image to have a self-signed certificate and then bind that to the database engine for additional security. But because we're developing locally here, I'm not super concerned about that. My network traffic isn't going out across the internet, and there's a very limited chance of a man-in-the-middle attack occurring, not to mention the fact that I'm working on sample data, so my need for security in this specific circumstance is quite minimal. Now, the other thing that you'll notice here is that there's a bunch of -v parameters on this Docker command. So this is going to be exporting a bunch of, or rather mapping a bunch of volumes to our file system. So basically, within the container environment, there's a /data directory. There's a /logs directory for the database logs. There's also a import directory to import data into the Neo4j database engine. And there's also a plugins directory that's mapped as well. And then this environment variable called Neo4j_auth allows you to set a custom username and password that you'll use to then connect to the database engine using either the Bolt protocol from one of the supported drivers or using the web interface. So we'll take a look at that in a moment here. So I'm going to go ahead and use this particular command to launch a new Neo4j database instance. So I'm going to open up the Windows terminal on my system here, just bump up the font size for you. And what I'm going to do, instead of running this in PowerShell, because we have this new line indicator character, which is a backslash. In PowerShell, that would actually be a backtick character up on the tilde key on your keyboard. That's the backtick character. That's the line continuation character for PowerShell. So this command, as it is, won't work in PowerShell, not to mention the fact that when you're doing volume mappings using Docker Desktop, it's actually generally a better thing to actually run this in the Windows subsystem for Linux. So make sure that you have Docker Desktop installed on your system if you're running on the Windows platform. And make sure that you have the Windows subsystem for Linux version 2 installed. And then Docker Desktop actually has a setting that allows us to integrate Docker Desktop with the WSL2 version here. So up here in the database engine, I have resources here. And then if I go to WSL integration, you can see that I can enable integration with particular distributions of Windows subsystem for Linux. All right, so back over here inside of my terminal environment, I'm going to go ahead and hit Control-Shift-P because I'm using the preview version of Windows Terminal. And I'm going to do a new tab and open up Ubuntu 20.04. And I'll bump up the font size again here for you. And now I'll just run the Docker command to make sure that that's working, do Docker version. Sure enough, my Docker CLI seems to be working fine against Docker Desktop. And the first thing that you want to do is actually download the Neo4j image. So you just do docker pull Neo4j, and that will download the latest version of the Neo4j container image from the Docker Hub registry down onto your local system. And then once you've done that, go ahead and just paste the command that we just talked about here, which is this one. And this is going to spin up a new container. Now, if I do a docker ps, you'll see I actually already have a container with that particular name running. So I already have a container named test neo4j. So in my case, I'll actually have to change the name as well as the ports in order for it to run successfully, or I can just kill off my existing container, which I think I'll do here. So I'll do docker rm-f885, which is part of the unique container ID up here, and that will delete the running container. So now I can go ahead and repaste my command here, hit enter, and as you can see, I have a new GUID printed out for my container. So I'll do docker ps, just grab this GUID here again, and it looks like that container is up and running. And if I do docker logs on 44e, you can see that we have this message down here that says started, and the remote interface or the web interface for Neo4j is available at port 7474, which we mapped from our local system to the container. So let's go ahead and head over to that URL now and just make sure that it's working okay. So back here in Firefox, I'll just paste in that URL, and sure enough, I am connected here. Now you'll see that it says connect to Neo4j, it says database access is not available. So you can actually hit the web interface without authenticating. However, in order to actually authenticate to the database that the web interface connects to, you do need to provide your credentials. And of course, as we looked at just a moment ago, those credentials are here embedded in this environment variable called Neo4j auth. So the username will be Neo4j followed by the password, which is test. So let's go ahead and just plug that in here and hit connect. And there we are. We are now connected, and if you just click on the database icon up here, you can see that we have the system database and we have the Neo4j database. So that's all there is to spinning up a Neo4j instance, and now that we've got this up and running, let's go ahead and actually start playing around with some of the example data that is included with the Neo4j database engine. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.